through my practice in coal bed methane, it was always conventional versus coal bed methane. But unconventional has come to mean a lot of different types of reservoirs that just aren't conventional. So it's an umbrella term that usually refers to new resources that are being developed now because of increases in technology. Coal bed methane, as I said, is definitely one. Coal bed methane is where you drill a well into a coal seam and you pump water out and the gas comes off of the coal and floats out the hole. A couple of issues that have arisen in the past with coal bed methane is coal bed methane is not part of the coal resource. And there's a citation to the Amoco versus Southern Union case that the Supreme Court decided. And that was really key in the development of the coal bed methane play because previously there was a question about whether when the federal government reserves coal, whether or not that was also a reservation of gas. And when the Supreme Court ruled that it was not, that really opened up development, especially in northeastern Wyoming. And that was coupled with the timing of a development in technology that allowed better recovery of that resource. And the big issue with coal bed methane is what to do with the water that comes out of the well. That's been the most controversial issue. This is just an example of what's happening underground. And on the left is the conventional reservoir where the yellow is usually like sand, or it could be any other type of geological formation, but that's a common formation. And then the gas is in between those sand grains, and the sand grains have some permeability. They're not stuck together and sealing off the gas, and the gas, when you drill down in there, the gas comes out. Or sometimes negative pressure is put on the wellhead, so it's sucked out of the ground, basically. With coal, it's in between those fissures of the coal. So I'm sure a lot of you have probably seen a piece of coal. It's not very porous when you look at it. It's delicate, but it's not like sand. You can't look at it and see that there's lots of spaces in between those sand grains. So, and it also stores a lot of water. So the water is pumped off and the gas just kind of floats off. And later in production, it's also sucked out by putting negative pressure on the top. This is an example of a coal bed well, and I've got better illustrations for coal bed because of a lot of the work that I've done in there. But as you can see, there's the different geological formations going down, and when they reach the coal seam, which I have up here, the gray on the edge of the vertical well is concrete or steel pipe. That is all sealed so that there's no communication of the water or the gas that comes out of the bottom. It's sealed from the surface down to the coal seam. And then at the coal seam, it's under-reamed, so there's kind of a little hole that's dug in there. The water is pumped off in that middle pipe, and then the gas just floats up. Oh, yeah. Okay. But here, it's also helpful to see the different formations. Sometimes the coal seams aren't thick enough to be economically produced. There's clay stone. Some of these actually seal off these formations. So clay stone can keeps this gas from continuing to go up, and it keeps the water from continuing to go up. And this right there, the concrete or steel pipe are a combination of both, which is often used. That seals off these other reservoirs. So this water that's coming up here, and this gas that's coming up here, as long as the well is done right, it's not going to go into these freshwater aquifers. Other examples of unconventional reservoirs are shale reservoirs. This is what's really getting the focus right now. The Bakken is a shale, Marcellus shale, Eagle Ford shale. There's several in Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma. In Pennsylvania and Ohio, it's the Marcellus and Utica, and North Dakota is the shale play. And this is a map from the Energy Information Administration of the known shale plays. Unfortunately, South Dakota is not touched by a lot of that. But I don't know if you're seeing it, but even in Casper, we feel the impact from North Dakota. Our school system has an additional, I think it's 600 students this year compared to last year. And the superintendent of the schools was saying on the radio that he was asking one kid where they had come from or what his parents did. And he said that his dad works in North Dakota and comes home periodically. So there's such pressure on the infrastructure and such a lack of housing and lack of facilities to handle that boom that it's really bleeding over into other states. And our service companies from Wyoming do a lot of work. I have some clients in Gillette who have a trucking company, and they're in North Dakota probably 75% of the time. Tight formations, shale formations are often referred to as tight also, but that just means that the rock where the oil or gas is being stored is not very permeable. This is an example of how tight formations are developed. I love these illustrations. You can see up here at the top, here's the wellheads. And when I talked about the Pinedale Anticline, how they might have 2 or 3 wells off of one well pad, that is being developed to the point where they can have 10 or more, 20. That's constantly being developed where they're minimizing the environmental impacts up here. They have larger well pads, but there's far fewer of them. So there might be 1 per 640 acres, 1 per section. And then they drill down, and this is such a long distance. And when you think of a piece of metal pipe or a piece of PVC pipe, it's straight and it's not bendable. But if you add another length of it to the end and keep adding lengths and you try to pick it up, it bends. That's what's happening here with drilling and with the drill string. So we're such large areas that they can bend those drill strings and direct them to the various areas where they want to produce. The difference in the spacing is on top. You might have 1 well pad per 640 acres, but technically the spacing underground can be as dense as 1 to 5 acres. And I've had a client who actually was in the Jonah field, that's how they felt they needed to produce those reservoirs, because these rocks are not interconnected and they're not very permeable. So you can't just stick the straw in from the top and start sucking on it and have the whole pool come towards the well bore. It just doesn't work that way. So you have to go in a lot more spots to try to recover the resource. And this kind of production was not economical just 5 or 10 years ago, and increasingly gets more economical. More resources are opened up to us because of the development of technology, including the horizontal drilling, fracking, and you also have to have an increased demand and therefore increased price. Gas hydrates are just kind of a trivia sort of thing that are also considered unconventional, but it's basically gas that's frozen. And that's a resource that could be available in Alaska. And in this discussion, as far as this is information also again from Energy Information Administration, and they talk about how much gas is in place. and that there's 320,000 trillion cubic feet offshore. And it could be, let's see, I don't think it said how long it could fulfill our needs, but that gas is not recoverable right now with current technology. And so it's considered a resource, but it's not, it can't be considered a reserve because it's not economical to recover. So the company can't consider it an asset on their books. Back to this diagram, these are the unconventional resources in this picture. So this is shale, and it's been trapped by some sort of capstone. And then there's gas that's in the sand that hasn't migrated up and is maybe being trapped there because of low permeability, and in part has not migrated up because of time. This is just an example of horizontal well. We saw some examples in the slides this morning, and this is what they're talking about when they talk about horizontal drilling. They drill down, bend the drill string, and then go horizontally through. And it might not necessarily be completely horizontal, but it goes through laterally through the reservoir. Here's another illustration of how this works with a well pad that has multiple wells on it. So here's the well pad, and then it goes down and has, each of these has 8 laterals off of it. And then the little black marks that are off of the white drill well bores are illustrations of fracking. And when they drill down and drill the well bore horizontally, then the fracking happens now in the new technology. It happens horizontally. So it happens within that reservoir right there. Right there. It doesn't happen here. And what they're trying to do is permeate that tight, low permeability reservoir. And they can, I don't know what the latest distances that they can go with these horizontal laterals, but they can do 20 frac jobs, I think is the last I heard. So they go all the way to the end, and then they shoot in fracking fluid, and then they back up and put in more, and back up and put in more. And I'll go a little bit more into hydraulic fracturing later, but it all stays within that reservoir because they're very low permeability and they don't want it to go out into another reservoir because otherwise the oil or gas is going to be escaping that way and not into the wellbore. Enhanced oil recovery is a term that in Wyoming we're hearing a lot of. I don't know. I think that even in North Dakota they're starting to look at it a little bit towards more towards the infancy of the well. Enhanced oil recovery simply means recovery by non-traditional methods, doing other things to stimulate the reservoir. Someone referred this morning to the Spindletop field in Texas. We kind of have our own type of Spindletop field in Wyoming. That was a Salt Creek field that's just north of Casper. And there's a Supreme Court decision that talks about pictures of that field looking like a forest of oil derricks. And that field, I think it was initially drilled probably before 1900, but this decision was from 1910. And there were oil derricks all over the place. And yet today that field is still producing because what they're doing is injecting water. They've got one area of the field that they water flooded so that they're pushing the oil out and increasing the fluidity in the reservoir. And then they've got another area where they're injecting CO2. There's some very interesting liability issues that arise when you're developing an old oil field for enhanced oil recovery. The Salt Creek field, and my brother works out there, so I know a few of the stories in my hometown is just north of there. But they have, the field is so old, they don't even know where all the old oil bores are, well bores are. So when they started injecting CO2, they started getting leaks in various places. And when they started injecting water, they started getting leaks. And sometimes that can cause significant environmental concerns, but also significant safety concerns, because that CO2 is under huge amounts of pressure. And so it's not something to be taken lightly, and it is a huge capital investment to be able to do enhanced oil recovery. And again, just so that it wasn't forgotten in the hydrates, a resource is something that's in place, but it's not necessarily all recoverable. A reserve is something that is economically recoverable. Technology is there to be able to pull it out of the ground. And here's just a few additional resources for learning the terminology. Okay. Not checking for my phone calls, just got to figure out that one time. The stakeholders, like I said, are the ones that make oil and gas litigation really interesting. The first category I started with is the mineral owners. And we heard this morning how you identify the mineral owners, but that can get really tricky. And there's been plenty of litigation over who owns minerals, whether the reservation was sufficient to reserve the minerals, what kind of minerals were reserved. I reviewed a deed one time that said oil and gas and other kindred minerals. And the question was, is uranium included in that? And so my answer is no, probably, because oil and gas is generally in the hydrocarbons and uranium is a mineral. But there's, when you're looking at these deeds, sometimes they go back a long ways, and you've got to figure out, a lot of areas haven't been developed before, so people don't know whether or not they own minerals or not. There's also state governments involved with school sections, and our state is very involved with making sure they get their royalties and their service use payments. Federal minerals, there's so much of Wyoming that is federal land that the federal government plays a huge role in our oil and gas development and all our mineral development and all of the regulations that they have for any action. Like I said, any action that they take, they need to go through the NEPA process, anything that will have a significant impact on the environment. And then there's combinations of those, whether they are through trades, the government has traded lands before, or there's variations in the types of reservation. The example of coal and coal bed mining is one where there's split mineral ownership, not just split estate between surface and minerals, but you've got split mineral ownership. So even in northeastern Wyoming, with the development of coal bed methane, there were a lot of questions about how is that going to impact the coal mines. And I'm going to go drill a methane well right here, and I don't want you expanding your coal mine and wiping out my well. So those are other areas that lead to litigation. And a lot of times the way they handled those was to enter into agreements for how they were going to proceed once they got to the point where they might have to wipe out that well. There was actually a recent case where the coal mine and the gas companies got in a dispute. I cannot remember what the issue was, but the other thing now that coal bed methane in Wyoming, in the Powder River Basin, is largely, I wouldn't say it's quite dead, but it's pretty close. And that's, a lot of it is because the water management regulations have gotten so onerous that it's become uneconomical to produce. But another reason is some of those wells have just lived out their life. But now there are a couple of companies that are coming and be able to produce it. One of the companies is called Liquid Technologies, and everyone refers to them, or was referring to them as the Bugs Company, because they're going to biogenically enhance the reservoir and put in microbes that generate additional gas. The problem that they are having, and there's been a fairly public battle with the BLM, is that the coal companies are saying that they're worried that that process is going to harm the coal and make the coal more difficult or heat it up. Because these microbes, I think, partly feed off the coal. So that's another area where different mineral ownerships, different mineral rights can get in conflict. Landowners are significant to the development of oil and gas and a significant source of litigation. As much as I would like to say that the industry I work with all the time always respects landowners and always does it right, that's not true. These companies are made up of human beings, all with varying levels of responsibility. So landowners, like Max said this morning, I definitely agree. I always want my mineral owners to negotiate service use agreements when they lease their property. But if you have a landowner who doesn't own any of the minerals, they're in a more difficult spot as far as their leverage for negotiating. Most companies will negotiate good service use agreements where they acknowledge all of the surface owners' operations and try to accommodate them. But that is a relatively recent, I'd say 10 or 15 years that's been the approach. Because previously it was the mineral estate is dominant, the surface estate is servient, it has to be that way or else you never have any value in the minerals for the mineral owner. And the term was reasonable and necessary. Whatever the mineral owner needed to do that was reasonably necessary to develop the minerals, they could do it on the surface. That's changed partly because the companies just acknowledged it's way easier to operate if we can get along with the surface owner. And we have to acknowledge the disruption that we're causing for their operations. But there's a wide variety of landowners that are impacted. We typically think of farming and ranching, but there has been a there's been a lot of rural subdivisions developed over the last several years. And that presents a whole different range of issues, because when you're developing on a farm or ranch, there's lots of open space. But when you're developing in a rural subdivision that might have 40-acre tracts, you're running into houses near every level. And setbacks are usually about 350 feet. But some leases are going to 700 feet, and you get to the point where, in some areas of this country, it's gotten to the point where those setbacks that are imposed by regulation basically create an area where you can't develop at all. So that's definitely been an issue in the east where there's a lot more density, and we start to see it more and more here now. And then in Wyoming, we've definitely seen an influx of people establishing retirement homes, retirement properties. The area that always comes to mind with this issue for me is called Clark, Wyoming. It's up on the Wyoming-Montana border in northwestern Wyoming. And there are a lot of people that bought little 40-acre properties that came here to retire, or they have vacation homes there. They put a lot of money into building their dream house, and then a few years later, an oil and gas company came in and said, "Good afternoon, we're going to be drilling on the lot next to you." And in that area, I think that the company that went in there did not do it very responsibly. They ended up having a well blowout, and it's called the Crosby Well. It's infamous. And what happened was they had drilling mud spill out going to the ditches. But not only that, they were driving on roads, causing a lot of dust. They weren't doing any dust mitigation. And there was just a small operator who wasn't very conscious of the surface owner's rights, and surface owners who had no clue that when they purchased that property, this could happen to them. And so they paid top dollar for scenic property and then realized someone has the right to come in and drill in my backyard. So those are prime areas for litigation, for disputes. And that's an interesting situation because I don't think that there's ever been an actual lawsuit filed, but landowners in Wyoming have associated with environmental groups in a lot of circumstances like that. And instead of taking it directly to the court, they take it through the process of environmental regulatory agencies. So there's been a lot of study and they try to develop a group and ways to mitigate those impacts. But